Welcome back to Talent Experience Live, brought to you by Phenom, where our purpose is to help a billion people find the right work through applied AI. I'm Monica. Happy Thursday. Hiring fraud is one of the hottest, scariest topics today. It went from a background concern to a top 5 CHRO priority between 2025 and 2026, and most organizations are just not ready for it. For today's episode of TXL, Devin Foster of Phenom will be joining Amit Fernandes from Checkr to break down the 3 core types of hiring fraud. They'll cover why fragmented hiring systems are making all 3 harder to catch and what you can do to overcome this critical hiring problem. With nearly 70% of HR leaders lacking confidence in their ability to prevent fraud, this conversation gets into what it actually takes to build a hiring process where trust is baked in and how AI is a critical part of the solution. So if you're responsible for who gets through your door, you don't want to miss out. Let's get into it.
Amit, welcome to the program. It is a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Super excited about it. Fraud detection all over the news. So we'll get right into it. But first, let's give you a moment, introduce yourself to the people and what you do at Checkr.
Absolutely. Thank you, Devin, firstly, for inviting me for this exciting conversation today. I lead our enterprise products at Checkr, where we actually power background screenings for some of the largest employers in the country. Now, we sit at a unique intersection where we see hiring fraud patterns at scale. This is across millions of screenings, before most organizations even honestly recognize that they have a problem. So that's exactly what I'm here to talk about today, because we have a certain vantage point that I'd love to bring to the table.
Yeah, awesome. Super excited about this conversation, but I want to give the audience just a brief overview. So let's start big picture. When we talk about hiring fraud today, what types are we really discussing, and what do organizations need to understand as they look to tackle these sort of challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. What we are seeing is that fraud is really showing up in more parts of the hiring process that many teams really expect. It's not really just one issue or one bad profile. We see 3 distinct categories of fraud in hiring. So the first is what we tend to call as credential and employment misrepresentation. This can mean inflated experience, fake or manipulated licenses, diploma bills, fabricated education and employment history. The second that we see is interview fraud. This can include things like deep fakes, proxy candidates, where one person participates in an interview process, but a whole different person actually shows up on the job. And the third is identity-related fraud, which includes typically things like identity theft, synthetic identities, or misuse of genuine documents, for example, using a real but borrowed ID. What's important is that these categories can sometimes also overlap. So someone may misrepresent experience while also using a questionable identity, or trying to manipulate the interview stage itself.
It's interesting because fraud has been around forever, right? I think the criminals and the people that are up to no good are always trying to cheat the system. So in the recruiting world, it's not something new. But I want to ask you, what has changed recently that has brought this to the attention of the C-suite, of executives, and why are they so concerned, since it is a tale as old as time that people are trying to deceive for their own benefit, right?
Yeah, hiring processes and hiring workflows, really, if you fundamentally think of it, they are built for speed and scale, more operational efficiency, right, rather than fraud resistance. But now what's beginning to happen is that the insider threat is no longer just a theoretical exercise. It's becoming a balance sheet problem. The hiring connection is quite direct to this. So 1 in 3 data breaches now stem from insider threats, which is basically either your own employees or contractors. And when a company hires someone fraudulently, whether they misrepresented their identity or credentials, they haven't just made a bad hire. They've actually handed a bad actor legitimate access. Maybe it's a badge, physical proximity to people in the company, or a trusted internal role where they now have access to all sorts of data. So the cost of really getting this wrong doesn't stay in HR anymore. It hits operations. It hits compliance. It hits the brand. It also hits retention, whether it's customer retention or sometimes even employee retention. In regulated industries, you can add fines on top of all of these things, right? So one fraudulent hire can trigger a cascade that touches every part of the business today. And that's why this has moved from an HR process issue to a board level conversation. We tend to say that the shift from speed to speed with integrity is absolutely real in 2026 now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, with the speed at which technology is moving, I think that a lot of the checks and balances, not that they are being removed or overlooked, they're simply just being circumvented by some of these people who are avoiding these particular background checks. I want to focus on one thing that I know Checkr had in a report. Fraud detection actually showed up as one of the priorities for CHROs for the first time. What does that tell you about where this is headed, right? We understand right now it's an issue. It puts the balance sheets in jeopardy, as you pointed out. Where do we think this falls as a priority 2, 3, 5 years down the line if CHROs are already beginning to rank it as so important?
This is really interesting. Within a 12-month period, fraud, especially identity fraud, has broken into a top 5 concern with CHRs. This tells me it's not just a trend, right? It's actually a system under duress. If you fundamentally think about this, hiring risks have shifted for organizations. And most organizations are really playing catch up right now instead of getting ahead of it. So for years now, fraud has been treated as an edge case, and arguably so. It would happen occasionally, and there were a lot of processes and human verifications that would catch this. What's changed now is that the threat surface has expanded. Think about remote hiring, which really took off during the pandemic. AI-generated credentials, which have now taken off really in the last 24 months. Deepfake interviews. The reality is that the tools to deceive have never been more accessible. So at Checkr, what we see this play out is we see this across millions of screenings and hundreds of data points associated with it. That's exactly why we are building the identity layer for hiring. We want to position this not as a bolt-on, but as a foundational layer. The questions we are really helping CHROs answer is this person who they say they are right now before they can even walk in through the door? And the organizations that are getting ahead of this aren't reacting to fraud anymore. They're designing it as part of their process from the beginning.
As they should. It's going to continue to run rampant. And also within this report, I know it mentions that 31% of leaders actually feel confident in preventing fraud, which leaves, I believe if my math's correct, 69% don't. That's a big number, right? When we think about that lack of faith or lack of trust within their own operations, their own systems today, how does that impact day-to-day hiring? I know everyone is trying to get talent in the door as fast as they can, schedule interviews as fast as they can, shorten that apply to hire timeline. How does this sort of threat really impact that on a grandiose level?
It's wild to think that just 1 in 3 organizations think they can prevent hiring fraud today, right? What this really tells us is that these organizations know it matters, but they don't have the processes or the visibility to manage it with confidence. That's what they're expressing really to us. Now, hiring teams are working with workflows that involve many siloed systems. And these typically lead to a lot of blind spots, right? And when you don't trust your own processes, you tend to start making decisions based on your instinct rather than a signal. That causes all sorts of chaos. It can slow things down. It can lead to bad decisions. More questions get asked during that process now. Now, the organizations that are closing this gap share one thing in common, right? And we are working with many of these organizations. They stop treating verifications as a checkpoint at the end of a process, and they've really started embedding it at the beginning and throughout. And that's the shift, really. At Checkr, that's what we are doing with identity verification, right? We give hiring teams a clear early signal. Is this person who they claim to be, firstly, right? And then before any other decisions are made, we help set that foundation in place so that everything downstream gets faster and more defensible.
It makes sense. And that's the way the world, I think, is really headed overall, right? I think back to the kind of CAPTCHA tests. Are you human? Right now, it's
Yeah.
are you who you say you are? Before we start to proceed with this process, even though a lot of the hiring workflows and things like that are being automated, they are being augmented by AI. It's important to get this step correct so that you're not bogging down your system. You don't have bad data within your CRM or within your ATS, because all of that causes even more challenges. You mentioned that some of the siloed technologies are a little bit of the reason as to why companies are exposed. Would you say that what part of the hiring process would you say companies are the most exposed right now? Is it that onboarding, you've accepted the position, or is it early on?
It's at every stage of the hiring funnel. I wish there was just one place where this was happening, right? And that's what really makes it so difficult to catch if you think about it. So it starts with, if you think about the process, a hiring process in a classic organization, it starts with the application. Companies are now beginning to see more embellished resumes, fabricated credentials right up there, right? And today, most of these companies are looking at it, and it's the human eye test that's helping them figure this out to some extent. And then it moves into interviews where you're seeing deep fakes and AI tools make it genuinely hard to know, like, if you're even talking to a real person sitting in front of that screen now. It then progresses into the background screening process and the onboarding process, where you have influx of synthetic identities and fake documents coming in, whether it's fake pay stubs, fake educational transcripts, even fake work authorization documents, really, right? It doesn't stop there. That's the problem. Like, if the fraudster gets it and they get hired, they keep that act up. So this is a problem right up front, as well as an ongoing problem for every organization out there. The reality, Devin, is none of these patterns are new. We've seen these before. We've seen fake resumes before. We've seen fake documents before, but they were difficult to create. What's new is the scale. AI has given fraudsters the ability to run these playbooks across hundreds of applications simultaneously. That's really the inflection point we are at, right? The fraud didn't change. The leverage has.
I think back to, I think, the most common form of fraud as human beings is catfishing, right? And back in the day, it was, oh, that image is photoshopped, right? We don't say that anymore. Now that's AI, right? That is what it is. And it has given folks the ability to put on a different persona than they truly are. And it's at every level, as you mentioned. I think of the Titanic, right? The reason why the Titanic sank was they couldn't stop the water onto the boat, and eventually the entire thing sank. That's terrifying for organizations today if water is coming in from all places and they potentially could be exposed. When we talk about the fragmentation across hiring systems, why is this so dangerous? Why should CHROs be losing sleep at night? Why should hiring managers really look to rectify this now before the Titanic sinks?
Yeah, this goes back to something I said earlier, right? Most hiring processes were never designed with fraud prevention in mind. They were purely defined with operational scalability in mind, right? So if we step back and we think about, again, a classic hiring process, think about the systems that are involved. So maybe upfront you have an ATS that does sourcing and candidate application management and so on. Then that transitions into the interview phase, where you'll typically have a video conferencing app. From there, you move on to the offer stage, and a background check or a background screening provider comes into the picture, followed by onboarding and HRIS systems. I just rattled out about 6 systems, right there. These are usually separate systems with separate data, separate controls, and honestly, there's no shared intelligence flowing through this system. Now, every handoff in this funnel, from sourcing, right, up until even post-employment, once the person becomes an employee, these are places where gaps can be exploited. Fraudsters know this. They will keep hitting your process until they figure out the seams in the hiring process that they can then exploit. And they tend to exploit these handoffs, right? So this is the approach that we took when we looked at the process at Checkr. We built an identity layer for hiring. And what we do is we frictionlessly validate that identity upfront of an individual and reuse that trust throughout the process. Now, We combine this with a single platform that seamlessly moves the candidate through and through and provides a 360-degree view and an evolving view of their profile at every step. This is the synthesis that catches fraud, because if it slips from one process, you will actually find more signals and build on that as you keep going ahead, and you will learn more about the individual.
It's 6 different systems. It's a house with 6 different doors and 6 different keys, right? The fraudster only has to find one that works. But if you're backing that up, you're syncing it all. It's going to protect your organization. Circling back to that, 1 in 3 organizations don't feel that they are protected from fraudulent or fraudsters. Do you think that most companies are underestimating this as a threat right now? Is it truly reaching the masses? As the scale of this is quite frankly terrifying of how we could be exposed to a fraudster? What would you say that the temperature is overall?
Absolutely. I think the recognition of where we are in this process is relatively early, and there's a lot of fear and apprehension today. Most companies don't know what they're missing, because fraud really never gets flagged if you think about it. If a fraudster makes it through an entire hiring process, gets hired, and then they start performing adequately on a job, which many of these fraudsters can really do, a company may never connect the dots. But the breach, the data loss, the compliance violation, all of this, when it tends to happen, it gets attributed to something else entirely. It rarely comes back to a hiring decision that gets scrutinized. That's what makes this actually so insidious, right? Like, companies think they don't have a fraud problem, but they may simply not have visibility into the problem today.
It's interesting, because how do you close that gap? How should the industry think about this if there isn't a pattern, if there isn't a way to track it back and potentially identify some of those weaker points within your system?
Fraud is, I tend to say this, and we tend to say this at Checkr more broadly, fraud is a community problem. It's not a one company problem. Even if one company does their job really well, right? A fraudster will probably just walk across the street and get into the next company with no one being any wiser about that. So most companies don't engage in a cross-company signal sharing today. It's just not a natural stage that we've been at in the hiring process. Now at Checkr, we see the patterns across millions of screening that no single organization could see on their own, right? And what the data tells us is fraud is more pervasive, more systematic, and sometimes even more coordinated than hiring teams think. There are truly fraud rings out there. We recently highlighted how a single SSN was being used by 10 different individuals across 3 different industries in gig, fast food, and frontline retail, and more importantly, in 6 different states across the country. So it's important now to not just ask, is this identity real? What we are doing with the data that we see is we are taking a step back and saying, hey, is the totality of everything we know about this person making sense together? Right? And that's what enables us to highlight such cross-company fraud signals, which frankly, no point solution or an internal team would have the data to be able to figure that out.
And the other aspect of that is they would have to kind of raise their hand and say, "Hey, we made a mistake. We messed up here. Yep. Let's highlight this." And I think back to obviously not the same scenarios, but I can't remember the name of the casino, but the casino that was held for ransom, right? When their systems were exposed, yep. And it was through, I think, in HR professionals' LinkedIn, right? Like, that's terrifying. It didn't get to the point where the news covered it until it was like, oh, there's millions and millions of dollars at stake here, and safety as well, because nobody wants to admit their fault. Nobody wants to admit that they've made a mistake, and they truly can't, right? To their point, because they don't have access to the information that you just described. I want to ask you, when we talk about that scale today of SSNs across states for multiple organizations across industries, what surprises you the most about that? What is the thing that you are, I don't want to say wow, because that makes you feel like it's impressive and exciting to see, but what truly surprises you about that?
It's fascinating to see how coordinated these operations are. More often than not, it's rarely one bad actor, right? What we've seen is many cases, these are And sometimes these are industrialized in the form or shape. Sometimes they're just coordinated very well. But we are seeing fraud rings show up, right? This is basically organized groups systematically targeting the hiring pipelines across multiple employers simultaneously. They're using AI, obviously, to generate a lot of convincing artifacts, whether it's resumes, deepfake technology to pass video interviews, right? And synthetic identities or even stolen identities to clear background checks and background screening processes. But it's becoming more and more clear to us that there's a playbook that they're following. The part that surprised all of us a lot was how far into an organization this goes. It's not just entry-level roles. We are seeing it in technical positions. We are seeing it in roles with access to privileged systems and privileged data. And fundamentally, higher the access, higher the incentive, right? So they're trying that more now. We sit across millions of screenings at Checkr, right? And thousands of employers, and the breadth of data that we see allows us to then step back and take a look at what's going on, right? Like, does any of this, do we see some patterns emerging, whether it is with PII, whether it is with names, locations, so on and so forth. It's a network level defense that we are now beginning to see emerge because, again, a single company can't break this equation very easily.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that you mentioned it's not just entry level positions, because I think of some of these higher, more senior, tough to fill roles is the ones where you could see HR professionals skipping steps, right? It's, hey, we need to get this individual in here now. They can do their background check, after they go through fundamentals or onboarding or whatever that may be. And it's no fault, I think, there is a fault there, but the reason being is there's so much pressure, and it's terrifying to think about. You mentioned that AI has ramped up the usage of this. It's increased those rings, but we're also leveraging it to detect it. And I think it is, you need it, but you also don't want it, right? I'm a runner, Amit. So my dad gets on me all the time. He's like, if you keep running, you're going to destroy your knees. And I'm like, I understand, but it's keeping me healthy now. I view that the same way I view AI right now, where it's fraudsters are using it, but we're also using it to detect it. Do you think at the end of the day, it will ultimately build trust or erode it when it comes to dealing with candidate fraud?
AI tends to get a bad rep a lot. But again, going back to something I said, it hasn't changed behavior. It has just scaled behavior. That's what it's done for fraudsters, right? And what you just said about building trust and eroding it, they're probably both true simultaneously. But it's also the right tension to sit with, right? AI has lowered the barrier to fraud dramatically. But the organizations that are winning right now are the ones who are also using AI defensively. They're using it to detect synthetic identities. They're using it to flag anomalous patterns that they see. Also to verify identity at real time at a scale that no human process can match. So the fraud is AI powered, but the defense also has to be AI powered. And if we step back and think about this, AI really doesn't determine whether trust is built or eroded. The decision to invest in the right infrastructure does. So a hiring process designed in 2019 is not equipped to handle the realities of 2026. And that's the problem that we see. And that's the problem that organizations who are combating this are solving. They're using infrastructure like Checkr to design their trust into the hiring process today from day one. They are not retrofitting it after something goes wrong or after they've been highlighted about a breach. That's increasingly where we are partnering with organizations to make that call proactively.
It has to be done, and I love the analogy of using strategy from 2019 and trying to apply it to 2026. It's not going to work. We're not dealing with the same level, the same scale as you've pointed out, and I agree. I don't think it is either eroding or building trust. Just like my knees, they're going to go no matter what eventually. But I'm going to have a great VO2 max. I'm going to run a marathon before all of this is done. So that's the price that I pay for moving at the speed of light, if you will. One of the big, I think, concerns that talent acquisition teams are going to ask when it comes to this is they want to create a frictionless process. I know that has been at the pinnacle of their interest because speed is becoming ever more important when it comes to hiring. How can they add a verification process that won't create friction, but also legitimizes their candidates that are coming through their flow? It is slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? How do they create that process in order to protect themselves, but also keep up with the Joneses when it comes to candidate expectations?
Yeah, this is such a real reality for hiring professionals in 2026, especially CHROs. Right? On one hand, they have to own the risk of fraud in hiring. But on the other hand, they want to make sure that they don't make the process so frictional that candidates don't want to engage. Like if a candidate feels they are being surveilled, they will not engage in the process. So there is a balance, right, to this. And what we found is that what really works best is when fraud management and detection is built natively into the hiring workflows than being bolted on as a separate step. So at a basic level, if you think about it, identity validation helps to really confirm the candidate is a real person presenting legitimate credentials, right? Now, in modern staffing workflows, that could include things like government ID capture, verification, document authenticity, so many other things. One important thing to think about this here is IDV is usually a multi-step process. So organizations who are relying on just a lightweight step up front are probably still leaving the door open for fraud to happen downstream. But now if they keep introducing IDV and an extensive IDV process over and over again, it's not going to help them. I'll give you an analogy since I love some of the analogies you've used, right? I have been thinking about the experience at the airports these days, especially at San Francisco. You now have TSA pre-check, which is touchless. Very interesting. The first time I went through it, they actually ran a detailed identity validation on me. So they got my face, they got my ID, they got everything. Now, when I go to the airport, I just show up, the camera looks at me, validates it against the record that they have, and they're like, yep, you're good, move through. My experience today is far better as I go through it as compared to what it was 6 months ago, where I stood in a line, held an ID in my hand, there's a human who looked at it. So there's always a balance between how much friction you introduce and then how it actually helps you as you go through the process. So I tend to think of the same thing in hiring. Using that identity verification upfront and just capturing that identity up there enables any company out there to then run re-verifications at a much faster way. They are just simply looking at the person's face and saying, match it back to the ID and going like, yep, this is the same person I'm interacting with throughout the process. Designing that process ground up and thinking about these elements is the important part. I'm going to go back to the 2019, 2026 thing, right? In 2019, these were not a concern, but in 2026, stepping back, re-looking at that entire hiring process and figuring out where all do you want to now make sure that you put in certain steps to ensure the person's identity is an important factor.
And a part of that, I think, is being upfront and honest, right? The reason why we are okay with, providing that facial recognition to the airport, it's for our safety, right? At the end of the day, that is what we have all signed up for. That is what we expect, and it makes the process smoother. If you introduce that identification verification step in the early stages of the process and say, hey, this is to give you the best opportunity to be hired. This is, for your protection, to protect the organization against fraudsters when it comes to the application process. Sure, it may turn some individuals away, but at the end of the day, your talent acquisition team is going to have a better influx of candidates. And if you're implementing agents and voice screenings and things like that throughout the rest of the application process, that's just a small bump in the road from them filling out their application, doing an intake survey and doing potentially an interview with AI that same afternoon, right? There's no waiting game back and forth anymore because their ID has been verified and all of that prior to them talking to a human. It sounds like the right scenario, but it brings up that other great question: speed and accuracy. Has the trade-off changed? Are you starting to notice organizations saying, speed is great, but we need more accurate candidates. We need to stop being susceptible to some of these challenges with maybe not fraudulent to the aspect of someone's trying to expose the organization and their data, but simply using falsified resumes and things like that still cause hiccups in the system.
Yeah, what we're seeing is that in 2026, the reality is the mindset is now shifting from speed to speed with responsibility. So going back to your question, the trade-off hasn't really changed. The cost of getting it wrong definitely has changed, right? So hiring teams have always been caught in this uncomfortable space of moving fast and hiring right? And that's typically been like, I want to get the right candidate with the right skills for the job who can excel. But what's shifted now is that the consequences of a bad hire are no longer just contained to performance anymore. The consequences now can be operational, financial, and reputational all at once. Right? So when identity is now, again, identity verification is embedded at the start of the workflow, before the interview, before the offer, fundamentally, you're not really slowing anything down. You're really accelerating the decision that matters, because what you've already established is a foundation of trust by doing this. The organizations that we are working with are getting verification right upfront, and they realize that it doesn't add friction, it actually removes it, because eventually they spend less time second guessing, less time in legal, and less time in managing the fallout of a bad hire, which should have never happened in the first place. Right? So speed and accuracy really aren't really trade-offs anymore. The trade-off is between, again, investing in the right infrastructure now or paying a higher price much later.
It took me far longer than I'll ever admit to get this, almost 20 years. It's speeding in a car. It's, yes, for a short while, you will get from point A to point B much faster, but the cost of speeding tickets, the danger in car accidents and things like that, it's not going to happen every time. But if you drive the speed limit, you follow the laws of the road, you're going to be safer and less exposed to any damages and things than if you were to ignore those, right? Yes, it's quicker in the short term, but just get there safely, happily, healthy. That's what's important about this. That's the message.
I love that.
The cost of not doing that is vast. We've talked about the challenges. We've talked about why you should do it right. What does a modern multi-layered fraud defense system actually look like across the hiring journey?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and we've thought about it a lot with some of the largest organizations in the country. I'll take a leaf out of how fraud is being handled in other parts of an enterprise, right? So if you think about IT fraud, like basically people trying to hack systems and hack computers and hack the application itself. When engineers have been thinking about fraud in that world, they've never thought about it as a point solution. Fraud has always been thought about, or rather fraud defense has always been thought about, like a Swiss cheese model. Right? You have to put sufficient layers of fraud defense in place so that you make it either increasingly difficult for the fraudster, so the cost goes up for them to keep actually trying to beat the system, and it even gets increasingly more difficult for them to actually pierce through so many layers of defense. That is exactly how our customers are now thinking about the playbook in hiring, right? So again, it starts with, if you fundamentally step back, it starts with IDV, which confirms the identity of the candidate, that this is a real person presenting legitimate credentials now. Then we proceed to detecting fraud on the resume, which is typically looking at things like embellishment of credentials, maybe employment embellishment, education embellishment. You'll also probably validate some behavioral signals along the way. You're capturing signals like, what's the device? What's the IP? What does the email validity on the resume look like? We then see customers deploying deepfake detection in combination, again, with IDV re-verification during the interview process. And again, they're trying to understand, right? Like, are they speaking to a person? Are they speaking to the same person who entered the process upfront? Stepping ahead from there, you get into the background screening and the onboarding process. Again, over here, a set of fraud tools get deployed. Things like detection of fake employment documents, fake education transcripts, even fake work authorization documents. And then in post-employment, after the individual is hired, monitoring their ongoing activities, whether it is monitoring their criminal history, We are increasingly seeing another trend show up for organizations where people are doing multiple jobs simultaneously, but not informing the employer about it. There's a term now coming up in the industry for this, where they call it moonlighting, really, right? So companies want to know, like, hey, I hired this person. Are they moonlighting? Are they working in multiple companies? Because that could be a breach of trust now for them. So it's, again, multiple layers with coordinated information and shared intelligence passing across these layers so that it's not siloed and a fraudster cannot break through.
Yeah. Because if you're just protected in one of those doors, in one of those scenarios, the rest of them are open to it. I think of credit card protection, right? It's not just the amount that you're purchasing, it's the location that you're at. It's potentially the device that you put it on. All of that built together to your Swiss cheese model creates an accurate depiction of if this is actually you using their credit card. They know it's me when I'm traveling because I'm at the airport. The first thing I'm doing is buying a glass of wine. So we're like, all right, Devin's traveling someplace. Let's see if he gets another glass of wine when he lands. I'm obviously kidding there. But it's important, right? All of this is vastly important. And the moonlighting aspect is something that we could have an entire other episode on, because I think that's going to, with the augmentation of artificial intelligence in people's workflow, I think it's only going to happen more. And organizations need to protect themselves from it. I want to ask you, if a company is getting it right now or in the next few years, what do you think hiring will look like in 2028? We're already almost halfway through 2026. So 2028 sounds far away. The Olympics are there. But what do you think that looks like, down the line in just a few short years?
2028 will be so quickly, right? So the way some of the largest organizations who are really speeding towards solving this problem proactively, I look at it is they want confidence at every stage of the funnel. That's really the name of the game, right? They want the application to be verified even before it's reviewed. They want the interview to be authenticated before it starts. They want the background screen to be connected to a confirmed identity, not just a name and date of birth, right? And then they want the onboarding to begin with certainty, not assumptions. So the process is faster, not slower, right, as they do this, because what they're doing is they're establishing trust early and carrying that through rather than questioning every step and slowing it down. Mm-hmm. There's a cultural shift in here, though, right? And this is the bigger one. Like, the organizations that get this right won't just have better hiring infrastructure. This is not just a technology problem. They're fundamentally going to have a different relationship with risk. So they need to think about this more as a strategy problem that they're solving, right? Fraud just stops being something that happens to them. It will start being something that their process is designed to prevent, right? So in addition to thinking about hiring quickly, they need to think about hiring safely, right? What excites Checkr and me the most is the network effect from all of this. Now, as more organizations build verification into their workflows, the data will get richer. Patterns will get clearer, right? And fraudsters will lose their leverage as a result of that. So a fraud ring that can game one company can't actually game a network level defense. That's the key that we are moving towards. So what we want to build at Checkr is build trust in hiring that's assumed and architected.
No, it's so important to have that rich data because the organizations are leveraging a Checkr in the way that you described. Instead of that social security number being used 10 times, it's used twice, right? And a flag is already raised, and that's not anything that shouldn't make anyone feel better, right? Like, it's, hey, this one's done. We have to identify this. We have to figure out, and you're saving other organizations, and in turn, they're saving you, right, in the future. For anyone who's listening, you mentioned the mindset shift, about being safe and protecting your organization and doing the right thing first. For folks who may have been listening and identified that they have gaps, right? What is the first step that they need to make in order to try and rectify that? Obviously, it's called Checkr, right? And figure that out. But that's a process that's going to take time. What can organizations do to start to shift that mindset internally, to start to identify this as a future problem that needs to be looked at now? Because if they're not exposed, they may be very shortly.
Yeah, this is a great question, right? I we tend to say that companies need to stop treating fraud prevention as a compliance checkbox, and they need to start treating it as a business risk function. Right? Just the way this has happened in other parts of the business, where fraud prevention in engineering or IT has always been a business risk, fraud prevention in hiring is moving in that same direction. For years, background screening has lived in HR operations. Right? It was a process step, not necessarily thought of as a strategic capability in a lot of places. That framing is changing rapidly because the threat that companies are managing today, it's more of an existential threat for some organizations. The next shift that I'll say is companies also are moving more from a proactive posture to a reactive posture. Sorry, the other way around, from a reactive posture to a proactive posture. Mm-hmm. So most teams are set up today to respond to something when things go wrong, right? So if there's a great human eye test that catches a fraudster, then they realize that, okay, something is not right, and they act. But an incident, a breach, a bad hire that surfaces 6 months later is very expensive for organizations. So the ones that are winning right now have inverted that, right? They've built a process that assumes fraud is present, and they verify accordingly. The third thing is to stop thinking in silos. Now, even in the hiring process, I mentioned 6 systems, but there are also multiple teams. You have a talent acquisition team that's different from the hiring manager, that's different from the onboarding team. Fraud in hiring doesn't really respect these org charts, right? It will get through wherever it can. So if those teams aren't sharing signals with each other, again, organizations have a blind spot that can be exploited. So it's a mindset shift at its very core. Trust is just a default thing that needs to start being put into the process, right? It's something the process has to verify at every stage, and HR leaders who internalize this in the next 12 months or so will be fundamentally positioned to handle the world differently as they look ahead.
It's exciting to have this conversation with you. Trust is earned, right? It's not given, and you're going to have to earn, the trust of organizations in order to apply, in order to prove yourself, to do all of these things. That's just the world that we live in today. You mentioned the airport analogy of going through TSA. When TSA is working and everything is running smoothly, it's not a bad process, right? It is, and it's there for everyone's safety. Amit, this was a wonderful conversation. If folks want to learn more, I know we mentioned a couple reports, things like that. Where can they go to learn more about Checkr and protecting themselves from some of these fraudsters?
Head over to checkr.com. There's great resources around resume fraud. There's great resources around identity verification. We have some great information out there about what we are learning from CHROs. So look it up and hit us up. Let us know how we can help you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. We're going to circle back 2027. We're going to see what has changed, how we can talk about that. I'm sure we'll have you at IM Phenom again next spring. But thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And we'll chat real soon.
Thank you for the conversation, Devin. Take care.